Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Trust, the Best Risk Management Tool for Megaprojects. My name is Shalika Sivathasan, and I am the Administrative Assistant in the Continuing Education Department at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and who are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we begin, I would like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. In order to maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. Kindly note, the chat function has also been deactivated. However, we do highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit any questions you have for our speaker there. Questions will be addressed during the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your OAA transcript. Please just allow a few weeks for the processing and reporting of these hours. And lastly, please note that the presenter does not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. Now, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today's session, Walter Gaudet. Walter is a senior executive and architect who brings more than 25 years of AEC sector experience, leading national practices and delivering Canada's most complex city building infrastructure. In his new role at Rimkus, he will oversee the expansion of their built environment solutions capabilities across all Canadian offices, having previously held a similar role at AECOM. His portfolio is defined by megaprojects that demand rigorous risk management and deep collaboration. He has provided executive oversight for critical mandates, including the Bloor-Young capacity expansion and the Terra Canada NCA Science Hub. Walter believes that the ultimate potential of any project lies in reconciling diverse stakeholder requirements through a process that balances rational analysis with creative inspiration. He argues that in an era of increasing complexity, the strongest contract a team can have is a unified culture of accountability and transparency. So with that, please join me in welcoming Walter Gaudet.
Thank you so much. Oh, what a great lead into today's topics. I'm not going to read the description out loud. I'm sure all of you know what you've signed up for, but certainly did want to go over the learning objectives and maybe the overall theme, which Shalik absolutely just touched on, that trust and transparency, not contracts, is really the missing link in risk management in mega projects. And so the learning objectives here today: to reframe litigation risk as a failure of adversarial contracts, to distinguish financial risk models used in collaborative contracts, to implement data integrity using common data environments for project risk control, and to apply best practices to manage scope creep and cost uncertainty. Just a quick walk through the agenda. I'm going to kick it off with 3 books that really inspired the presentation that I've come to know and love, and introduce that overall concept that I'm driving at of a radical collaboration on mega projects. But we're going to start with what I've called the ugly past. So infrastructure mega projects in Canada over the last 50 years, with a couple of specific case studies. Eglinton Crosstown, which of course many of us have heard about and lived through, but also a bit of a success story on the SkyTrain Millennium Line. Before getting to what I'm calling the messy middle, the world that we're living in today, the active projects really. So new procurement models and collaborative standards that are being implemented, including brief case studies of Ontario Line North and the Union Station expansion project. before finally landing on an optimistic future and really the bleeding edge of ideas around collaborative models and transparency. And especially, I would say, being led by some Indigenous-led infrastructure projects. I'm sorry, leaving time for Q&A at the end. Each section, I'm going to kick off with a favorite quote of mine. So in this case, really setting the tone for the whole presentation. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So really, that's an idea around changing the system if you don't like the results. Another famous quote, of course, the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Um, Projects don't fail accidentally; they fail by design, and so planning for success involves changing the systems that we're operating in. But as promised, I'm going to kick it off with three books. Podcast I listen to on a regular beat, the Ezra Klein show, ends every session with, what are three books you'd recommend to the audience and why? So here we go. Off the top, Megaprojects and Risk by Ben Flyvberg. Summarized here, I'll confess when I've used AI to embellish this presentation. This little book summary AI output and really kind of nailed it. So the particular focus on the book is what Ben calls the iron law of mega projects, a bit laughingly, I suppose, but over budget, over time, over and over again. And why does he think that's so? Two main culprits, and I will focus on them through the presentation. An optimism bias, where we are underestimating risks and typically overestimating the chances of success. But in some cases, too, a strategic misrepresentation of what is actually happening on the ground, either misleading for approval, misleading to secure next steps, and really setting up the project for failure with unachievable expectations. Consequences and solutions and recommendations I will touch on through the presentation. Second book, Why Nothing Works by Mark Dunkelman. And I think more and more we feel that way, right? As we look at the state of infrastructure development across the country and around the world. A bit of an American bias here, admittedly, but really speaking to an evolution of how work has been delivered. That in the early 30s, 40s, when the first mega projects were coming out of the post-war era, certainly a centralized, expert-led, politically driven, build big, build fast. So, for example, the New Deal in the States. Certainly backed by the concept that they were exercising that power for good. But a shift through the 60s to a bit of a fear of the establishment, certainly a feeling of being bulldozered by people who know better, and really a reaction on the public side to start to ask for more transparency and ability to slow down and weigh in on these mega projects. I think here in Toronto, the prime example of this shift is the Allen Expressway, which was meant to carry on down through Spadina, right? But ended up dead-ended at Eglinton due to public engagement and a reaction against. The fear that Mark has is that now that veto power is so strong that essentially nothing can be pushed through. That there is so much red tape and there's such a loss of public trust that everything is second guessed, third guessed, and so nothing advances. Again, some proposed paths for the future that I'll touch on later in the presentation. And a bit of a curveball here with the third book that I'd recommend everybody read, but Radical Candor by Kim Scott is actually an approach to people management. If you are people managers, if you have staff, if you have direct reports, she's placed approaches to that relationship on a four-grid matrix that progresses from caring personally about your team and challenging directly, being candid, right? Being transparent. And some thoughts around what that feels like when you're in those situations, from a manipulative insincerity where you just don't care and you don't choose to challenge. But really the ideal being this concept of radical candor, where you are transparent, you're clear, you're providing feedback in a timely fashion, and you're coaching to develop improvements. I've taken that last jumping off point in particular to set up this grid that I think of as a step towards radical collaboration. So in the lower quadrants, the combination of low data transparency and a low concern for the community. Progressing, into the upper echelons of high concern for the community and high data transparency. So every mega project is going to live and maybe even evolve through some of these stages and quadrants. And I will do that as I walk through the case studies. I'll sort of position them, as they sit within this grid. But just a little bit more detail. So low communal concern, low data transparency. What does that feel like? Strategic misrepresentation, unachievable budgets, fake targets, again, really just being used to get go-aheads. And what does that result in from the public's perception, certainly, and frankly, even by being a participating team member, being the architect on one of these jobs? A cynicism sets in, right? Which can be quite deadly. But as you move into at least a nod towards concern for the community, but a withholding of information, a low data transparency, usually the way that's portrayed or the way that feels is that participants are staying silent about failures that they're seeing or objects that they're encountering to protect the public from a feeling of panic or to avoid political fallout for themselves. But again, that's a very paternalistic stance, right? And I think to be avoided, where there is a silence, but the idea that centrally somebody knows better. And so that's why they're driving this thing through. The flip of that, low concern for the community, but to high data transparency. Usually that takes the form of something like the math says your house must go, right? The line is going through here. So data is used as a bit of a weapon, right? There's a feeling of efficiency and foresight, I guess, that's driven through with less regard for social fabric or for the truth on the ground. And again, what's the reaction to that? Usually hostility, right? And just a word of warning, I mean, I certainly don't dwell on it, but I think some of the recent federal bills, provincial bills, C5, Bill 5 here in Ontario, is about increasing the ability to become this executive bulldozer. And I predict that again, the equal and opposite reaction will be hostility. So I think the easiest path through is more of a cards on the table approach, right? There's a high communal concern, there's a high degree of data transparency, and there's alignment between what's being said about the project, how the project is being documented, and what is happening on the ground. So problems are shared early to protect all impacted parties' ability to plan around those circumstances. And the result, I think, is a feeling of reliability. So taking that step back to see where we've come from and, with a little bit of a wry smile, what I've called litigious stalemates and suing our way to a finish line. Another quote by Upton Sinclair: "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." Apologies to everyone participating. Obviously, a little centric on the man here, but stated in 1935. But the concept, I think, is to make sure you're incentivizing the results that you want. People respond rationally to their incentives, even if the ultimate outcomes are irrational. So I think setting up the correct incentives are just incredibly important. But some highlights, really lowlights of our mega projects, millions, billions of dollars spent between 76 and 2006, beginning with the notorious Olympic Stadium in Montreal. I won't go through all of these. Really, the point was to show the pattern, right? Very few opening on time, virtually none of them opening on budget, with the exception of the SkyTrain, which again we'll highlight here in a few short minutes. And probably the most timely and topical with the opening of Eglinton Crosstown very recently, but again, a bit of a case study on Eglinton. Eglinton, I would say, I mean, it's obvious, is not an anomaly. It's more the dominant pattern. Another bit of AI generation here, but I was quite compelled. I asked it to produce a an evolutionary tree of procurement models, and based on the information, this is what it produced, which I think is quite interesting, right? So a bit of a horizontal timeline and evolution of models, and I certainly will go into more detail in the subsequent slides. But from traditional design bid builds, which is how the Olympic Stadium was delivered, to design builds such as the Confederation Bridge, the Hibernia Project, P3 projects, DBFMs, which many of the hospitals delivered in Ontario, other public projects delivered in Ontario through the 2000s, 2010s. And now moving into kind of a post 2015 collaborative era where we're seeing progressive design builds, we're seeing alliance contracting. And truly, I think each of these stages from a certain perspective is a move towards more and more transparency and trust amongst the participating team members, and in the best cases, transparency to the public as well. So just a quick snapshot. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on them individually. Certainly we can in the Q&A if there are any specific questions, but I did want to differentiate models, right? So as we talk about them, we sort of know where we stand. So traditional design bid build, I'm sorry, the key point is the separation of the designer and the contractor. So the owner going into two different models that are sequential and transactional, right? But what that does is allows the owner control over the design and a maximum price competition amongst the contractors bidding on the project. I think a possible weakness, and we've seen it, a high risk of litigation. Certainly, the owner bearing all the risk for design errors and omissions that couldn't have been costed by the contractor at the time of bid. In response, really, in that evolutionary tree, design builds were created, moving the entire risk of design constructability to the contractor as a single point of responsibility and speeding up the process by overlapping design and construction. The weakness, again, certainly from an owner's point of view, a bit of a loss of control over design details once that contract is signed. P3 is adding a few more initials to the DB, right? Essentially, a DB with financing and life cycle accountability added to the contractor. So the contractor providing the capital, providing the maintenance of the facility, creating skin in the game for that contractor over the 30-year term, transferring that risk. But the weakness, high procurement costs, and difficulty to change once that contract is signed, right? It is meant to be a fixed price over 30 years. First is the newer models, so progressive design build, a two-staged design build, essentially, a process where the owner can walk away after phase one. Phase one is really about iterative discovery, reducing those risk premiums because the construction cost is not set till the design is about 60% complete versus maybe a 30% in the row above. So time spent in phase one exploring and determining what can be known, what risks need to be priced, and how should they be priced. I would say again, a weakness potentially is that off ramp, although it exists in theory, is politically difficult to use and to my knowledge has almost never been used because it would be embarrassing to step out at that point, of course. But it's there, in the limit, it is there to be used. And a somewhat similar model, but again, upping that collaborative spirit and contractual obligation is an IPD or an alliance. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to differentiate them. So you'll hear both used, certainly out there in the world. I think in many respects, they're near identical, certainly in their philosophy. And so again, that differentiator is a no blame big room, both literal and figurative. One single poly-party contract, shared profit pool, legal waivers banning the participants from suing each other, which I think drives the radical collaboration that I'm talking about and eliminates what I've termed an adversarial overhead, right? The risking in that price to deal with unknowns. So instead of pricing a contingency to deal with unknowns, you're turning the parties into a single problem-solving team tackling those complex, unpriceable risks together in the best way they know how. The difficulty, especially from a public procurement side, no fixed price shield, no big announcement that can be made at the time of tender as to a fixed price. It requires extreme transparency. And to some degree, again, makes it difficult or uncomfortable for traditional politicians and public auditors. What truly differentiates them? The who pays for the surprise test is what I've called it. So in design, bid, build, the owner pays. In a DB or a P3, the contractor is expected to pay unless they can prove it was a latent defect. And later on, we'll certainly touch on the point that a lot of time can be spent trying to prove just that point and really wasted time. In a progressive design build, as mentioned in phase one, those parties are trying to find the surprises before the price gets locked in. And in an IPD or an alliance, everyone pays for that surprise out of the shared profit pool. The who's the boss test. In a DBB or a PDB, the owner is clearly the client. They're holding the contract. In an IPD or an alliance, the owner is a partner and can be outvoted by project leadership team on certain technical decisions. And lastly, a change test, which maybe relates to that who pays for a surprise test. But certainly if you expect project scope to change, here I use the example of a new station being demanded somewhere on the line, or I would say just evolution of a program at a hospital, for instance. P3 is a nightmare of change orders, whereas in a PDB or an IPD or alliance, the system's designed to handle these changes more gracefully. The commercial structure is built around that idea of discovery rather than stasis. So case study number one, Eglinton Crosstown, a DBFM. Just to walk through the timeline, right? Announced in 2007 under the Transit City Vision at an estimated cost of 11 billion and a 2020 target opening date. Began tunneling in 2011. In 2015, the mega contract was signed, and at the time announced as a $9.1 billion fixed fee. So again, politically represented as a $2 billion savings over the original budget with an opening date of 2021. 2016, the tunnels were finished, but 2020, opening target date missed. Surprises found on site. I'll go into more detail in subsequent slides, but at the time it was announced that opening would be delayed until well into 2022. Over that timeline from 20 until roughly 24 and blowing well past 2022, more crises, more defects found, more issues uncovered, and opening delayed till 2023 at first, and then mid-2025 at the earliest followed, until finally in 2025, the project was handed over to the TTC and had reached substantial completion. And the actual opening of the line in early 2026, essentially $3 billion over budget, 5 years delayed. And so just on that window, what was found through 21 to 24? Legacy infrastructure failures, concrete cavities underneath Eglinton Station, forcing a halt to construction to rebuild everything, track misalignment, an 800-meter section that had to be rebuilt, posed a risk of derailment, water infiltration into the stations after they were constructed. On the rolling stock side, so the actual vehicles, manufacturing delays and retrofits. Once they were actually acquired and delivered, degradation of those vehicles as they sat unused, waiting for the line to be completed. And software failures under train control and signaling software also had to be resolved. On the legal side, what resulted through these surprises? 3 separate suits, ultimately, maybe most significantly when transparency is in mind, the TTC factor, as I've called it here, where the TTC was only brought in May of 23 and really inheriting the project, but were accused of shifting the goalpost by the builders with knowledge that wasn't shared ahead of time. All of this eventually worked through, but back to the grid, right? I would say the destruction of public trust through systematic deception and paternalistic obfuscation. So the fixed price myth, again, not delivered at 9 billion, but most particularly those delays dealing with what were unknown unknowns at the time of bid essentially pushed billions of dollars into a construction inflation spike. And the delays alone, it's thought, added roughly 1 billion to the project cost. Um, from the silent protector side, again, near completion messages being telegraphed, progressing well and nearing completion in 22, to eventually leaking that there was no credible plan to open in 22 and the great silence of 23 through 25, right? With a massive information asymmetry where businesses along the corridor had no idea what was coming and no idea how to make decisions around what to do with their businesses while they waited. So if we could, just a little bit of a catch our breath here, survey question number 1. Based on what you've seen so far, what do you believe was the primary cause of the Eglinton Crosstown failure? Primarily engineering and technical complexity, primarily contractor performance, primarily governance, risk allocation, and incentives, a roughly equal mix of all three, or not sure, need more evidence. So just wait a few minutes while you complete that, and I will anxiously await the results. And Shalik, I apologize. Are we going to share the results in real time, or will that just be paused for later?
Yes, I'll share them right after the poll.
Oh, super. Take a drink while we wait. Roughly equal mix of all three seems to be the winner. Absolutely, that's helpful. I think we've surfaced where people think the risk actually lives. So over the next sections, I'm going to try to show how different governance choices push those projects towards each other in the outcomes. Gonna have to speed it up a little. SkyTrain, the Millennium Line, again, a success story with some wrinkles. So 95 through 97, there was a local consensus that it should be a street level light rail line. But in 98, the province abruptly vetoed that idea, created a single purpose Crown Corp to force through a $1.16 billion SkyTrain, elevated SkyTrain. But to their credit, a couple of really innovative ideas that have carried on as best practice to present day. So first, a modular solution, off-site manufacturing of 6,000 precast concrete segments to be delivered on site. A municipal integration fund, $50 million in localized urban upgrades funded by the project, encouraging cooperation and the fast tracking of approvals and okays by the community. So finally, on time in January of 2002, the initial segment opened. August of 2002, the main line was completed. With one interesting epilogue, the VCC Clark extension not completed until 2006. And why was that? I framed it here as the executive bulldozer hit a wall. So it shattered when the SkyTrain had to cross the Grandview Cut, which was an active trench owned by BNSF, a protected international freight railway. And the province did not have the jurisdiction to expropriate the land or the air rights. And so the brilliant modular truss literally hung in midair for 4 years while the province negotiated. And so opening in 2006, I think it proved that technical efficiency and the executive bulldozer cannot override property rights and that they must be secured ahead of time. That ground truth must be achieved. But I do think, again, a good news story overall, an evolution of trust and the creation of public trust from override to legacy. So in 1998, trust at rock bottom as the elevated LRT was pushed through. The pivot, which maybe you could call a bribe, but certainly was a benefit, the $50 million municipal integration fund, where that low communal concern really evolved to a high communal concern. And because the project did hit its on time, on budget promise, the shame of that top-down decree really evaporated. And so again, just a few more bullets on that MIF. Usually I think there's a perception that the province bulldozes this line through, leaves a mess, and the city has to clean up around the edges. Whereas in this case, the province said, we will pay you for new parks, new streetlights, new paving around the stations, but only if we stay on schedule. And so getting that buy-in, getting that support, it was rebuilt. So to today, the messy middle and new models. The map is not the territory, a favorite quote, which really I think speaks to not mistaking models for reality. On the other hand, I'd say the closer the model is to reality, the more comfortable you should feel in using it. So just flagging that potential for disconnect between models and reality, right? And what I've called here the physical reality, or I've been referring to it as the ground truth, what's actually happening in the mud. The tunneling machine is stuck. Versus a digital or a technical map, a BIM model. What is happening? Well, the schedule says we're 85% complete, but in the past, that could be weeks out of date. And a political or public narrative, right? So meanwhile, the minister's announcing we're on track for a 2024 opening. When these are disconnected, they become their own little bubbles, truth bubbles, and can lead again to mistrust or certainly a doubting that there is any common truth. And so what needs to be built is a system of trust. And certainly a digital twin, a common data environment is one way to achieve more of that, right? And I think it's a bit of a shift from an old culture of systematic deception, where project leaders are almost rewarded for protecting the project by keeping it moving, which often means hiding disconnects and misalignments until they're manageable, which usually is too late to fix cheaply. But in that case, the digital twin can actually be a threat because it's making the disconnects visible. Whereas in a new culture, that project manager is instead a truth broker whose job is to ensure the gap between the narrative, the documents, and the physical world is as close to zero as possible. So in a culture of transparency, the digital twin of the project is actually the single source of truth used to determine where we're at. So a brief little survey too. In most large projects you've worked on, what actually happens when an unknown unknown appears on site? The owner absorbs the cost and delay, or the contractor absorbs it, or tries to litigate on the same, or months are lost determining fault before work can even continue, or the team collaborates early to resolve it. And lastly, depends heavily on the personalities rather than the contracts. So again, I'll give everybody a few seconds to cast their vote. I feel like we should be playing the Final Jeopardy theme as this happens. I'm sure everybody feels that way. A pretty even spread, I'm sorry, except clearly nobody believes the contractor absorbs it. Yeah, it's a good spot to be. I think what's interesting here, right, is I think what that points to is it relies heavily on how risk and authority are structured, right? It's rarely about technical brilliance. It's rarely about having omniscience. Again, it's about transparency, and it's about how that authority is structured. So on that, and this could be the boring middle bit, I'm going to go try to move through it pretty quickly. And again, certainly we can loop back in any Q&A to current collaborative standards and contracts that are structuring some of these interactions. So first, coming off of that comment on digital twins, ISO 19650, which I've tried to shorthand to information management process because its actual name is organization and digitization of information about buildings and civil engineering works, including building information modeling, information management using building information modeling. Not kidding. That's the name of this standard. But what does it deal with? Again, it's broken down into phases and stages, as most ISO standards are. So in procurement, assessment and need. Is there a formal project information requirements document where the owner has stated what information they need, when they need it, and for what decision-making process? Clarity of information really precedes good decisions. Has the owner provided a clear information standard and common data environment protocol? So how are we going to collect, manage, and share project information as that single source of truth to prevent drift and misalignment, that triple disconnect we were talking about earlier? In tender, did the bidder submit a BIM execution plan explaining how they will produce the shared information and exchange it to meet the project information requirements? Is the model information delivery plan contractually locked? So is it contractually agreed? The schedule of who delivers what to whom, at what level of detail, in what milestones. Information delivery is meaningless unless it's contractually locked in. In mobilization and the production phase of the project, is the CDE configured, tested, and mapped to the project teams? So tools fail unless they're adopted and assumed rather than governed. Is clash detection and federation happening in real time? So late discovery of errors or lack of coordination is a governance failure, not a failure of the software, right? The capability is there in the software. And finally, upon delivery and continuity of that information, is the published information verified against the original exchange information requirements? And lastly, at closeout, is that final asset information model handed over to operations? So structured information handed over at closeout to support asset operation, maintenance, future change out. Handover is where most projects quietly fail. A second standard, a more interesting standard, I think, where that is further locked in, but is almost a higher level approach. ISO 44001, Collaborative Business Relationships, an international standard whose intent is to focus and foster a culture of transparency, trust, and mutual benefit, providing a flexible framework to maximize the value created through working together. Again, broken into phases and stages. Phase one is called laying the foundations. Operational awareness, stage one. Establish your organization, your firm's high-level intent to collaborate and confirm that it aligns with your strategic goals. Stage two, knowledge. Build a detailed business case that identifies the specific benefits, costs, and risks of the collaboration. So you have to justify that collaboration, not just default to it. Internal assessment. Evaluate your organization's strengths, weaknesses, and readiness to partner by conducting a gap analysis. And not every organization is ready to collaborate, and you shouldn't go into it blind. Phase two, so identifying and working with the right partners. Vet and select a partner who's technically, financially, and I think most importantly, culturally compatible with your organization. Finally, working together. Establish an operational framework, joint governance structures, and a formal joint relationship management plan. Foster joint innovation and knowledge sharing to achieve mutual benefits that neither organization could reach alone. I mean, sometimes this is even an interesting concept within your firm. Are the different silos that always seem to exist, Are we paying enough attention to where mutual benefits can push us to a place that an individual silo cannot reach alone? Staying together, phase three, managing and maintaining. So continuously monitor the relationship and use joint management reviews to resolve issues proactively before they escalate, right? All of this presentation is about identifying risks early and dealing with them before they metastasize. And lastly, an exit strategy. All things must end. So activating a pre-planned strategy to conclude the partnership on good terms, protect the assets, and capture the lessons learned. I just wanted to walk through at an overview some of the models we've already looked at and how they do plug into this framework, the ISO 44001 framework. So I'm going to do them stage at a time, and I'm going to breeze through again. We're a little compressed for time, but operational awareness, right? So in a progressive design build, CCDC 32, I'm sorry, in Canada, in an IPD, CCDC 30, UK playbooks for digital design and construction, and a sort of synthesized global best practice. The highlights here, right? The idea of pre-contract prep, of starting up well, of actually assessing the market to see whether it has an interest in collaborative models, and an internal audit of your own team's training in relational contracting. So don't assume that because your team is technically strong, that also equates to teamwork. Knowledge, developing it during that development phase, validating project value propositions, responding to outcome-based specs, right? Defining what to do rather than how to do it, and ensuring that there's strategic alignment of all the partners. Internal capability gaps, right? Risk profiling, identifying those inherent and contingency risks, owners producing shadow bids to understand true costs independently. And as mentioned above, behavioral profiling. So ensuring that those big rooms that we're creating has the right collaboratively competent leads in place. Partner selection. Two-stepped quality-based selections with early market engagement. And what I call to your trial marriage, right? Using workshops and sessions to test dynamics under stress before actually signing the contract. Working together, that joint management team, progressive collaboration, the big room with oversight from management, delivery model assessments, and a governance rigor, again, as established by ISO 19650 for that common data environment and ISO 44001 itself. Value creation, how do we know that it's working, right? Target costing, added value incentives, social value mandates like the Municipal Infrastructure Fund that we talked about in the Millennium Line, and target value design, right? Designing to cost rather than costing a design. Relationship health checks, gates, off ramps if needed, no dispute clauses, waiving rights to sue, resolution planning, maintaining frameworks and escalation protocols to avoid disputes, and relationship monitoring, right? Trust surveys, neutral coaches, these are all fantastic ideas and global best practices. And the handoff, winding it down, right? Off ramps again, making sure that the project is ready for handoff through that asset management plan. Legacy management, ensuring that the owner does own the digital twin and is able to lock that in, and decommissioning. Survey 3. At this point, how would you describe your view of collaborative delivery models, PDB, IPD, Alliance? Do you think they're idealistic but unrealistic at scale? Do you think they're appropriate only for exceptional projects? Do you think they're increasingly necessary for complex projects? Do you think they're already proven, so mostly just a governance problem now? Or are you still unclear and need to see a few examples? Very nice. Increasingly necessary for complex projects seems to be the winner. Second place, though, which is a nice launch into the last section, still unclear. Need to see some real world examples. So let's have a look at some projects operating today. Ontario Line North, a progressive design build. Why? What happened? Why is Ontario Line North the PDB? Well, maybe no surprise, but after Eglinton, Metrolinx CEO Michael Lindsay announced and basically admitted that the key lesson was that we needed to move forward with collaborative contracts to avoid the litigation that defined Eglinton. The contractors themselves, too, essentially were saying, digging under an existing subway tunnel that's still operational, we're not going to sign a fixed price P3 for this. The risk is too high. And so the pivot was towards a progressive design build model. And I think PDBs are basically at the intersection of my foregrid, sort of a pragmatic middle ground, broken into phase, again, phase one, an open book, collaborative phase, where everyone's being paid and the consortium is working with the government to finish the design and figure out the exact risks that are on hand before committing to that target price and entering into phase two. If they can't agree, there's an off ramp, right? And both parties can walk away. So just a quick walk through the timeline, a little more succinct than in the previous cases, because again, these are actually underway. But two separate contracts, actually. So contract one for the elevated guideway and stations. The development and master construction agreement signed in February of 24, progressing through 25, completed that 20-month development phase, that phase one, and negotiated the final target price. Work started in February, and through the spring now, massive early works underway. Crews are performing board piling at Don Mills Road, building access roads in the Walmsley Brook area to support the new elevated guideway pillars. And so again, that elevated guideway will look an awful lot like the SkyTrain in Vancouver. However, some sections are underground. So contract two, paved tunnel and the underground stations. DMCA, I'm sorry, signed at the same time. Through July of 24, groundbreaking at the paved station site. So for those of you who live on the Danforth, you've certainly seen the work at paved station. Just a few months ago in February, 20% excavation achieved at the paved site. Through March now, commencing underpinning of the existing station. And now present day, well into decommissioning and final demolition at Pape and Salmon. Case study 4, Union Station Enhancement Project, or USEP as it's abbreviated, an alliance contract. And I think the true benchmark of present day models. It's actually the first major transit project in Canada to use the alliance contracting model. And what's most interesting about alliance is this statement in bold. When things go wrong, the project speeds up instead of slowing down, right? Rather than fighting, first, rather than hiding a mistake or blaming a partner and then fighting over who's to blame, that adversarial overhead, as I called it earlier, is eliminated. And so the team is motivated to focus 100% of its energy on engineering a solution rather than engineering a legal defense. And so I think really nudging us up towards the upper quadrant of radical collaboration. A poly-party agreement between the owner and the designers and the builders. A no-blame culture in that agreement where litigation is waived. If something unknown appears, nobody sues. They fix it immediately. And open book accounting. So no low bid lie. How's it going? How's it actually working? So the contractor is again radically candid on hidden conditions. Alberici has stated that they've discovered basically what you'd expect to discover when you're digging under a 100-year-old transit hub. Massive hidden conditions, scope adjustments, and RFIs that normally would have caused incredible delays. But instead of hiding it, they're saying that it's allowing them to efficiently navigate these shocks and resolve them together as a team. Metrolinx is issuing hyper-specific monthly ground truth reports. So rather than paternalistic language like progress is moving well, They're publishing detailed meeting minutes and presentations to the major landowners and tenants. And in the deck, I've actually provided a link to those. And so you can read them for yourself. But in them, you'll find incredibly specific statements like chipping of the atrium supports is ongoing, scanning of rebar in the signal bunker, prep work for the abutment footing. Nothing is being hidden, and the risks are being shared. Because neither the contractor nor Metrolinx has an incentive to pretend that it's any further along than it is. And so the narrative matches the physical reality and the digital model month by month. Similarly, the contract itself is public. So Infrastructure Ontario has published the Alliance Development Agreement, the Ultimate Project Alliance Agreement on their website. I provided links here. Versus what happened on Eglinton, where journalists, the Auditor General, had to fight for years to see the commercially confidential, unredacted P3 contracts. So in the case of USEP, the rules of the game are available for us all to read. And they've achieved ISO 44001 certification, which is no small feat. I think those of you who've gone through other ISO certifications know that you can't fake it. It requires rigorous third-party audits of how those alliance partners are sharing data, resolving disputes, and maintaining a no-blame culture. Lastly, let's land this plane. An optimistic future and unified fronts. In brackets, I said one team, one wallet, no blame. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. Really interesting quote. And the idea here, philosophically, was that if you were to design a culture or a system of justice, you should design it as if you didn't know which part in it you would play. So how would you design a procurement system if you didn't know whether you're going to be the owner or the builder or the designer? What would you want? What is a fair system? And I think fair systems outperform any other, which comes back to that system of trust and transparency and radical collaboration. And some pretty bleeding edge ideas as to how even that can evolve to higher states of data transparency and communal concern. And I'll walk through them pretty quickly. But on the digital twin front, what I've called an algorithmic alliance between smart contracts and digital twins. So how would it work? Let's say it was the rebuild of something like the Millennium Line with modular construction. The physical modules have embedded sensors. When the module is locked into place on site, the sensor pings the digital twin. Digital twin verifies that it's there. If it matches where it's supposed to be, the smart contract automatically and instantaneously transfers funds, or at the very least, I think we'd say approve funds, to the manufacturer and the installer. So that triple disconnect is forced to zero. The narrative, the document, the physical reality become a single automated source of truth. You don't need to trust the contractor that it's been done correctly. The building literally invoices you itself by confirming that it has been done. On the governance model, the UK is actually evolving towards an enterprise model, as they call it, with Project 13. So moving from a project mindset to an enterprise mindset. Instead of building a team to deliver one project, a train station, for instance, the owner builds a semi-permanent, long-term enterprise with core team members. So again, in an alliance, you're still just paid to build the physical asset, an LRT line. Whereas in an enterprise model, you're paid for outcomes. You're incentivized to provide a solution, which might mean realizing you don't need to build a new line at all, for instance. So if you could improve digital signaling on an old BRT line to double its capacity, would that actually achieve the end? So at an enterprise level, that's where the incentives lie. So because it exists over that 10-year portfolio, mistakes made early on can be corrected. And ultimately, you're paid for the final results. And lastly, on the societal front, I think community integrated delivery is a really interesting idea. Essentially, fourth party contracts where the community is a participating team member in the big room. So using some sort of system, again, sortition, which is essentially random selection or some other mechanism, a representative community trust is a fourth party signatory. And that trust joins in the pain, gain, share pool. So similar to the municipal fund provided in the Millennium Line, the community is actually incentivized to have the project progress, eliminating a certain amount of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, right? By granting the public that vote and open book access, you replace paternalistic silence with transparency. So trust isn't requested through public information acts or anything of the kind. It's guaranteed. And the public doesn't just watch the train arrive, they help drive it because their local outcomes are tied to that project bottom line. And I think the shining light on this front that we're seeing is actually through Indigenous-led infrastructure. A two-eyed seeing, merging Western engineering and standards with Indigenous stewardship and community-led governance of projects that improve their lives. So if we want to see bleeding edge, we just need to look to these Indigenous equity ownership models. They've moved straight into a system of trust and bypass that triple disconnect. So quick walkthrough again, what does that look like even through these ISO stages? Operational awareness, right? These are self-determined projects. The community has identified a need and have the jurisdiction for it before seeking partners, eliminating that paternalistic silence, of an idea being imposed from outside. They're internally ready through a community mandate. So using traditional governance or sortition style consensus to prepare the nation for the partnership and ensuring a unified internal front before external complexity hits. Partner selection made through value-based procurement, choosing partners based on environmental stewardship and social alignment, not just low bid, and killing that mega project mirage by prioritizing long-term health over short-term lies and misrepresentations. That relationship model, a joint governance structure that respects both Western law and Indigenous law, and a poly-party big room where those multiple worldviews can coexist. Governance and management through a joint venture where direct equity is held by the nation and a board seat with a veto or at the very least a consensus vote and an ultimate system of trust, right? You can't steamroll or bulldoze a majority owner. Business transition, so the transferring of that data, those skills to local community members, closing the triple disconnect, making the community the managers of their own data and project. Viewing the asset as a 100-year commitment to the land as opposed to a 5-year construction contract, overcoming that messy middle by focusing on the outcome, and an exit strategy where often that is the private partner leaving once the nation has total control and operational capacity. So the final evolution of this fourth party model, the community actually becomes the sole owner. And so two quick examples. The Enbridge Athabasca pipeline deal is the largest energy-related Indigenous economic partnership in North America at the moment. 23 nations and Métis communities in Northern Alberta, purchasing an 11.5% interest in 7 Enbridge pipelines for just over $1 billion. But the deal's successful because it's created revenue-generating assets and long-term contracts for long-term cash flow for the communities. So for example, the Fort McKay Métis Nation is anticipating about $500,000 in annual revenue from its 5% ownership in the partnership. So again, remember that is shared amongst 23 nations and communities. And just a second one, I do have trouble pronouncing it, I'll confess, but Watanikniap transmission project, the largest Indigenous-led and longest grid connection project in Ontario's history. So driving the electrical grid to Northern Ontario, 24 First Nations communities, controlling a 51% stake in this $2 billion project. It successfully constructed 1,800 kilometers of transmission lines to those remote communities, connecting them to the grid and ending their reliance on polluting diesel generators. And so beyond that economic partnership, it's a massive environmental victory, social victory, eliminating 6.6 million tons of greenhouse gas annually. It employed nearly 1,000 First Nations members during its construction and is being celebrated worldwide as an example of best practice and radical collaboration. So with that, and just over that hour mark, I will end here and thank you, and certainly happy to take any questions and answers that have come in, or questions that have come in, I suppose. I'll provide.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Walter. And yes, just under the 1 hour mark, so perfect timing. It looks like we already have a few questions in the Q&A box, but of course, for our attendees, you are more than welcome to submit your questions. You'll see the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to type your questions for Walter in there. We'll get started with the first few questions that we have here. So, the first question, this person asks, can this entire thought process be scaled down, so to speak, in terms of processes, methods, tactics, etc., such that your thesis can be applied to or utilized effectively by the sole practitioner who is never going to be able to compete on mega projects? So how can it be scaled down?
100%. I think, I think even going back to the Radical Candor book, right? I think that's about interactions with people, even at a one-on-one level. And, I'm tempted to flip back through slides. I won't because that would be so dizzying. But really, certainly personally, I can say it's always been my style. I was accused early on of, kicking landmines and then dealing with the shrapnel. I think honesty is the best policy, right? I think it's easier to deal with issues up front than to, push the bulge in the carpet a little further along and wait for it to hit the wall eventually. So, uh, I mean, I guess that would be a challenge, that would be a second presentation, but absolutely thinking through from a conceptual point of view, how can this be scaled down? I think there are valid points, in all four quadrants. And I think that's why even when you read the sort of emblematic behaviors, either in Radical Candor or in my idea, those behaviors exhibit themselves, right? You know it when you see it, when somebody's being passive aggressive or when somebody is being domineering. And so I think, how to move away from that to a place of trust and collaboration is really, really important and certainly worth exploring.
Great, thank you. So someone has asked here, in my experience with progressive P3 for healthcare as compared to traditional P3, it appears there is a higher risk to budget. There is a longer doubling up of consultants throughout the design phase. Indicative design and execution design team fully active. That's in brackets. And less client incentive to stay on budget. Is it expected that progressive P3 may increase costs, and are there ways to mitigate this?
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate thing about any model, right, is you'd love to be able to run the parallel universe where another version was tried, right? And of course, we never get that benefit. Um, I do worry, as you do, that it can be overdone, right? That let's call it the cost benefit analysis, I guess, of redundancy and of the extra studies and so on could be thought through. But I think what's weighing on the other side, and maybe it goes all the way back to that quote of you know a system's perfectly designed to do what it does. Um, I think we see in that 50-year legacy that early budget estimates have almost never been right. So what sometimes gets perceived as additional cost is probably cost that always would have been borne, if we'd been honest and transparent and had truly dealt with the issues thoroughly. So I don't know, right? I think it's right to be mindful. I think it's right to think that through. I mean, even as a taxpayer, right? I think we need to think about that. But um, the truth is there in those numbers that we seem to have do a terribly poor job of estimating true costs and then end up apologizing for it later. So in a sense, this is trying to prevent that, right? And to be transparent as those costs escalate with everyone, including the public, right?
Hmm.
Because then at least we know what we're buying.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. Um, so someone has asked here, for the collaborative delivery models where final cost is TBD through a transparent process, how is the public funding typically approved in advance?
Well, I think it might have been overstated in the TBD, ness of it all, because I think I use the phrase designing to cost, and that's maybe closer to the truth, right? Um, I've often thought about the IKEA model, as crazy as that sounds. If you're a designer at IKEA, I've been told, I've not done it personally, but you're asked to design a $25 lamp, full stop. We want a lamp. It needs to be sustainable. It needs to be easily built by the person who's bought it. But it needs to cost $25. This is the price point that we've set. And so I think that sort of reverse engineering from a desired price is possible, right? And I think that is what you see in IPD, certainly, where that target price, initially is a range, plus or minus, and you're just constantly zooming in closer and closer to target, right? And yes, in extreme circumstances, it can be adjusted. But I think it's about setting a target and working collaboratively towards it with all good ideas on the table, more than it is, blindly throwing a dart and hoping for the best. So I think if, again, if the government were clear, to some degree, BC's P3 models have always followed a bit of this, right? If a target price is known, I think challenging the designers to design to that target price, designers and builders, is a healthier way to go about it than to, design something, then cost it and act surprised when the number rolls in, right? So I think that's what I'd recommend.
Hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Someone has asked here, so knowing what we know about the Eglinton LRT, what type of contract do you think would have worked better?
Again, I think alliance is probably my quick answer, right? That was why I sort of landed there. I think, just thinking back through those last two case studies, I think present day, if IO had to rewind the clock and run it again, they probably would say a progressive design build, right? That is what was selected for PAPE. And I think I portrayed progressive design build as that kind of happy medium. So maybe even going back to the last question, right? Like I think what it tries to establish, again, certainly there's a budget price in mind, but that phase one is really about determining what the eventually accepted fixed price will be. So certainly at the transition from phase one to phase two, there is a more informed fixed price. I guess that's the least of what you can say, right? I think some of the Auditor General's criticisms of Eglinton were that the price was locked in with basically 30% of the actual real world knowledge on the table, right? The price was locked in at a 30-ish percent, design complete. Whereas in the PDBs, they're advancing it, again, with everyone's time being paid, to more like a 60% complete. And so you can have more confidence. Again, I don't know, 60% is 60%, it's not 100%, but you can have more confidence in that fixed price. And so perhaps as a bridge, right? Again, I think we've moved in that progressive design build model. I guess my pitch is that ultimately I do think IPD and Alliance are closer indicators as to what I would do or what I would want to see. And again, ultimately with that bleeding edge idea of even fourth party participation, right? Community transparency and participation, is I think how we can both get a lot more done and do it in such a way as everyone is calibrated and sort of informed and making decisions that help them move through this world.
Great, thank you. And we have, excuse me, just one more question in the Q&A window right now. So if you are working on typing a question, please do so again and put that in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. But we have a question here that asks, so it says, I believe you stated that the PDB is rarely used. Has it been used at all in Canada, and is there a future for PDB?
Again, I feel like the majority, certainly of the transit projects that IO is now putting out will be PDBs, until further notice. So definitely we're seeing a ramping up. You mentioned in the introduction, I was working on Bloor Young on the owner side, but that's being delivered as a PDB. The capacity expansion there, basically the doubling of the size of the platforms at Bloor Young Station, because of course it is the busiest interchange in the network. So I think owners across the board are interested in PDBs. For any of you who've worked on modified design builds with Defense Construction Canada, those are essentially PDBs. They follow a very similar pattern. So in the same way that I sort of hybridized IPDs and Alliance, I think you could say the same, that Defense's modified design builds are essentially PDBs. So some of you in the audience may have some familiarity there too.
Okay, great. So I don't see any questions in the chat right now. I was actually thinking myself, I appreciated that you ended the presentation with Indigenous-led initiatives, which I think is great to see. I wonder, with that sort of really community-driven style or model, has there been a lot of resistance to that? Are people, are these mega project owners, are they sort of accepting of it? Are they, open to those ideas, or what's your experience so far?
I think so, and I think it's evolving, right? I think the need, especially in northern communities, remote communities, is obvious, and it's been talked about for a long time. I guess water infrastructure is another one, right? That just quickly comes to mind that needs to be provided. And so certainly, I think the interest is growing, and generally speaking, those who have participated in the processes. Uh, Speak very highly of it. I mean, of course they would, I suppose, but I didn't provide links, but there are several YouTube videos by the participants, including those private sector parties who absolutely would do it again, right?
Mm,
Um, I should have said maybe in the beginning for what it's worth. I've not personally worked on any of the projects we're describing here, so I am going off of publicly available information, at least in terms of the detail. Certainly, that also means I'm not sharing anything confidential, but I mean, very, very interesting. And in other projects, as mentioned in the introduction, I have touched these models many, many times since the early 2000s.
great. Okay, so that's great to hear that, as you say, there's been openness and people are receptive to the kinds of Indigenous-led models that you described.
Well,
We actually got.
I think again, I mean, it's funny when I was debating what to use as a case study.
Mm,
Certainly, the Via Alto high-speed rail project came to mind, or another one that's possible, right? That's definitely in the news right now is the expansion of Billy Bishop Airport.
mm,
And I think where I'm intrigued, I mean, the high-speed rail line uh, has been in progress or has been talked about since the 1970s, and we don't have a high-speed rail line. Now, why is that so? Again, I think if you replay it through some of these lenses, what are we hearing about on the radio right now is the objection of those farmers and those landowners who the line might have to push through. I guess my proposition would be that if there was much, much more transparency and I would say fair systems of evaluation that could be bought into. While yes, if I were a landowner, would I happily accept the result of a systematized evaluation of where this line needs to go? It would still sting, obviously, but I think if I thought that the evaluation criteria was fair and that it had been transparent, I think one of the analogies that Dunkelman uses in his book, I didn't refer back to those books too much, but is the idea of sports. I mean, that may or may not be appropriate, but when you get a bad call or you're cheering for a team and your team gets a bad call, um, yes, that stings, but I think you accept the rules of the game because they were transparent and because you accept that that's how the game is played. And so I think he tries to make a parallel that if the rules of the game were actually transparent to everybody
mm,
being affected, that they would more happily receive the outcome. And
mm.
and so, the worst condition is when it's done under, a shroud of darkness, and you're just asked in that, executive bulldozer way to accept the result, right? And so I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Okay, we actually got three more questions, I think, in the meantime, so that's great. So, someone has asked, so for recent healthcare progressive P3s in Ontario, in brackets, two major hospitals, there has been limited competition, in brackets, only one bidder. Is there a way this can be improved?
Yeah, well, it was hinted at and I think the shift to PDB was at least an attempt to address that. That I think certainly through the DBFM deliveries, through again the earlier 2000s, when bidders were being burned by some of these outcomes, that interest certainly waned. Nobody wanted to play that game. So the PDBs are, again, I think Metrolinx and IO's response to try to make the game. I mean, I hate to call it a game, but for the purposes of the metaphor, more attractive to those bidders. Has it been successful? I don't know, right? I mean, maybe it's not enough, or maybe other things need to be done. Um, Another thing which you see certainly in transit, maybe less so in healthcare, but just thinking back to Ontario Line, it and other lines nationally have been split into different bundles, right? So perhaps a bundle in this case too, right, for the elevated rail versus the tunnel, and the stations that go along with that. In BC, I think we've seen projects split into three. So I think in some cases there's an attempt to break them down into, let's call it, more digestible bits that could attract smaller designers, smaller builders, right, where they're more comfortable. I think, again, as the projects have ballooned, as the budgets have ballooned, who's prepared to take that on? Sometimes it's a pretty tight list of who's actually prepared to do it. So fragmenting them is another one. Again, though, that comes with a downside, which is suddenly you've got different teams running around and trying to coordinate on the same site. And I guess in my mind, that's just another argument for that common data environment, common digital model, one source of truth that can't be contested. You're either coordinated or you're not in the model. If you're not in the model, you're surely not going to be out in the mud, right, in the real world. So I think it just drives back to that importance of the integrity of the data model.
Hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Um, Next question asks, I'm not sure if this is a question that can exactly be answered, but they've asked, will the public ever come to trust cost estimates for these large projects? How can public trust be gained back? Maybe you have some suggestions.
Again, I think maybe I'm wrong, right? Somebody tell me if I'm wrong. I think the only way to gain trust is through transparency. So the more information is shared about how that cost estimate was put together, um, the more open to challenge the person who's produced it is, and the more willing they are to correct when an error is shown, or again, just an unknown is discovered. I think that's the only way to grow trust,
Mm,
right? I mean, in the Millennium Line example, I suppose a sort of a reverse trust was created when the project was seen as successful. I mean, to some degree, you know, memories are short, and again, when something is seen as successful, some of the trials and tribulations are quickly forgotten. Um, but ultimately, I don't think it matters. Ultimately, I think everyone would feel better if that transparency and collaboration existed all the way through. And again, you know why something has been changed, and at least you can agree or disagree with it, but you form that opinion, and you're given the opportunity to raise your challenge if you have one.
right. That makes sense. And our last question here is asking, someone's asked whether you would be open to later communication along the lines of seeking strategic advice for non-traditional business models for private sector projects, that of the quote, missing middle scale.
100%. That's why
Okay.
I flipped to this slide, I think. So
Yes.
that is my phone number and email address now. I'm happy. I mean, I hope you can tell I love talking about this stuff. So, happy to do so at any point. So please, anyone, just reach out, and I'm happy to talk further.
Perfect. And again, we will be sharing your slides with our attendees today. So if you didn't get a chance to note down the email or phone number quickly, you'll get those slides later this afternoon.
Super.
But that looks like all of our questions. So I do have just a few closing announcements before we close off for today. So of course, a big thank you to Walter for this excellent presentation. It's a lot of big ideas. I think people have taken a lot away from it. So very happy to have you share your thoughts with us today. Thank you, of course, as well to all of our attendees and those of you who submitted questions. Thank you for your engagement with the polls as well. So again, last few announcements. For those who are seeking continuing education learning hours, again, a reminder that the OAA will record your participation in this webinar on your OAA transcript, so there is no need for individual reporting on your part. We just kindly ask for your patience at this busy time of year as we process and confirm the accreditation of your hours within the next few weeks. Again, all attendees are going to soon receive a copy of the slides, and you'll also be receiving a link to a survey to submit feedback for today's webinar. So we at the OAA and our presenters highly value this feedback. So if we do get a moment, once you receive the link, please do take that time to fill the survey out. We have 2 climate action webinars coming up next week. The first is on Wednesday, May 6th, and that one is titled Collaborative Action to Address the Climate Crisis Through Design. And our second webinar next week is on Thursday, May 7th, and that one is titled Low Cost is Low Carbon, Practical Design, Materials, and Policy Handbook. So again, those are both climate action webinars. If you are looking to complete your required 2 structured hours of climate action for your Con Ed, be sure to check those out. Again, for our list of our upcoming webinars, you can check out our Continuing Education webinar series page on the OAA website, and also the Con Ed Opportunities page for offerings by other organizations beyond the OAA. So with that, I will thank Walter once again for this excellent presentation. Thank you all for your attendance, and have a pleasant remainder of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.